Welcome to History Twists. Wow, what is that? Well, you've already heard, or perhaps you've heard a couple of the others already, but we'll explore what one small difference might have made in history. Now, I know that there's a lot of these kinds of podcasts up, but, Dr. Deneen and I, when we were talking about ways to do this and different things, we realized that it would be not smart for us to just do one style of doing this. So you will notice that there are different styles for different podcasts in this in History Twists. For example, the one that we're doing today's episode was basically Sean's idea. He dreamed about this for the longest time. He came up with it. He's very excited about it, and it is pretty cool. So, with that said, let's see what Sean has brought to us today. The thing that makes history so fascinating, well, at least one of them, is that the world we live in is not inevitable. Even the events and people that seem destined to occur, as they did, could have taken different paths. The very purpose of this podcast is to explore unthought of possibilities. The horror of Nazi victory in World War II has been explored and explored and explored, just like what if the South had won the Civil War? Done and done and done. So, the Nazi thing, whether there was a miniseries like SSGB or The Man in the High Castle, and The Man in the High Castle, hey, if you haven't seen that series, you really ought to check into it. It is really cool. Or novels. The assumption of national identity by a formerly dependent group which did not attempt to take over its parent country had, to quote Benjamin Franklin in 1776, he said, "It's never been done before."
Good evening, my friends. Happy Canada Day to our friends in the true North. Dr. Weaver is quite correct. I've been borderline obsessed with this topic for some time, and I'm very glad his style is a little different than mine. I'm very glad that we're going to work this in a unique way so you get the benefit of both of us. As he said, unlike Axis victories in World War II or Confederate victories in the Civil War, the idea we're going to be talking about tonight, Britain, the UK, retaining control over its North American colonies, has not been much of an object of curiosity.
This goes back to the Revolutionary War, right?
Yes.
Okay, so I just wanted to make our readers aware, that our listeners aware, that that's what we were talking about. Go ahead.
It really is an untapped area. I only know of two novels on this subject. The great Robert Sobel's For Want of a Nail, and my personal favorite alternative history book of all time, The Two Georges, jointly written by the actor and amateur historian Richard Dreyfuss and Dr. Harry Turtledove. Dr. Turtledove is probably the most well-known speculative historical fiction writer today. Each of these stories is well worth reading, both scholarly and very entertaining, and they advocate different changes that impact the empire, what would have become in our world the United States, and the larger world around it. Between 1765, when the first discontent in what was then called the 13 Colonies happened over the Stamp Act, and the outbreak of armed conflict between the United Kingdom and what would become the United States in 1775, there's 10 years in which tension ebbs and flows. Now, To my way of thinking, there were three periods in which both sides could have compromised, looked at the positiveness of their relationship, and turned back from an open break. In 1770, following the Boston Massacre and the acquittal by John Adams, no less, of British officer Captain Preston, as a gesture of conciliation to New England specifically, Parliament repealed some of the taxes on sugar, rum, paint, and glass, which had been created by the Townshend Act 2 years earlier. They kept the tax on tea and molasses. Colonial leaders, including the famous John Dickinson from 1776, asked the government and the king, George III himself, to officially recognize what were called colonial agents. Every colony had agents representing its interests in the UK. Benjamin Franklin performed that not only for his home colony of Pennsylvania, but many other states brilliantly. They wanted these agents to be put on the government payroll and recognized as crown officials. This minor request is refused. 3 years later, the outrage over the tea tax, which had provoked the Boston Tea Party, had persuaded the Parliament, personally at the King's request, to pass the Intolerable Acts. Now, a number of unpleasant things happened. The Quartering Act is passed, requiring soldiers to be put up in colonists' homes. Boston is put under military occupation, and the legislature of Massachusetts is disbanded, and the colony is put under a military governor. In contrast, the Quebec Act is passed to conciliate and cater to French-speaking Catholics in Canada. Now, the Calvinists in New England and the evangelicals in the middle colonies in the South were scared to death of Roman Catholicism. So this did not go over well at all. Now, a year later, a final attempt at negotiation was undertaken by a friend of Benjamin Franklin's, Joseph Galway, who created the Galway Plan that's debated at the First Continental Congress. Now, this would have created the rights for Americans to have titles, knighthoods, baroncies, and so on, an American aristocracy, and an intercolonial parliament in exchange for loyalty to the monarch, who would appoint an official very similar to the governor generals in Canada and Australia today, but with a lot more power, and have a royal veto over everything, every act this assembly passed. Now, I believe the idea of extending the privileges of aristocracy to English settlers outside of the mother country would have cemented the tide of loyalty which had once been so strong. Americans did not wake up in 1776 and say the British Empire sucks. It was a long process of alienation on both sides. The idea of an aristocracy worked brilliantly well in Canada and Australia in the 19th century, and in South Africa during its time under the British monarchy after the Boer War. Some positive things would have happened, in my opinion, if the imperial system had remained in place. Slavery had been outlawed in the UK entirely in the 1770s, so it probably would have been outlawed much earlier in the 13 colonies without a bloody war, without a century of divisions between North and South, without Southerners with some justification feeling stepped on, and all of the tension and separatism that created. In my opinion, emancipation would have happened in the early 19th century at the latest, with compensation to the owners, which would have avoided the sharecropping system and the subtler form of discrimination that segregation became. I think a peaceful solution to the slavery problem would have led to less racial tension. We have to remember, friends, discrimination in Europe was based on class, not race. The critical question in my altered timeline is what would have happened in other areas if the American Revolution had not occurred, and what events would have been necessary for it not to occur. The argument is based on two possible other outcomes. either a British defeat of continental forces in the military sense, or a larger US that incorporates Canada. There were many Canadians, particularly in Quebec and Nova Scotia, that did not want to remain part in the empire. So a man called Moses Hazelton creates the Congress's own regiment, which I believe could have easily conquered Canada. There's a wonderful book on that, Alan Everest, Moses Hazen, and the Canadian refugees in the American Revolution. This details three separate attempts to bring Quebec, what's now Ontario, where Ottawa is, and Nova Scotia, often called the 14th state, into the Union.
Although this is far from a popular opinion, the American Revolution was as much a civil war as the 19th century conflict over slavery. Now, Canada had been the indulged child of the British Empire, having been brought in due to the hard-won victory of the French and Indian War. The colonial leaders were smart enough not to tangle with the predominantly French settlers of Quebec and Nova Scotia and their beloved Catholic Church. Noted author Antonia Fraser, a Catholic convert, detailed in her masterwork, The King and the Catholics, was her title of the masterwork, the process of securing true religious freedom in Canada and the United Kingdom. And this is a quote here from Fraser. The world was divided into upper-class gentry and a working class. Recusants were allowed to pay fees to practice their faith in peace. The Catholic Relief Act of 1778 ended penalties for opening Catholic schools and legitimized the public performance of marriages, baptisms, and burials among the other sacramental functions of clergy in the Catholic Church. Now, Catholics who met the property ownership requirements could serve in local government and vote for sympathetic Protestants in the House of Commons. That's what Fraser said. It was no longer required for non-Anglicans to pay a full tithe to the Church of England, although donations were collected until 1813. Now, Canadians had their rights fully confirmed at the personal request of George III in 1774. The Anglican British making a deal with the Catholic Church at a time when few Catholics could vote in the UK was terrifying to the Puritan New Englanders and some of the evangelical Southerners alike in what would become the USA. The Quebec Act confirmed and expanded all previous rights and privileges given to the French-speaking population. The Catholic Church was given the right to collect tithes and be paid a supplement by the British government. The loyalty oath to the king was changed to eliminate any references to the Protestant religion. The French language was permitted in school and court alike. The quasi-feudal manner of distributing land and inheritance per Catholic doctrine, in which all male survivors would get equal inheritances, was tolerated and even encouraged. The modern equivalent would be as if our president announced compliance with Sharia law and halal dietary restrictions in the USA in a tweet, no less. Actually, sounds like something some megalomaniac candidates might do, just to screw with people. There was even a throne for the Cardinal Archbishop in the Legislative Council in Canada. American colonists made substantial efforts to recruit their Canadian brothers in the cause of separation from the British Empire. More than 15 months before writing the Declaration of Independence, the Continental Congress wrote what it labeled the Declaration to Our Fellow Subjects in Canada, unquote, declaring a unity of purpose between the two great peoples. The letter to the inhabitants of the province of Quebec, written by founding father John Dickerson, is a masterstroke of writing. The letter points to the actions of the mother country, aka the United Kingdom, ever since the passing of the Stamp Act 10 years earlier. It promised, quote, the air of freedom to a choked population, unquote. It is essential to look at this document in some detail to figure out differences in motivations. The whole methodology is seemingly designed to liberate Protestants, thus unwittingly alienating Catholics. Despite the fact that freedom of religion is mentioned, there's not a direct mention of giving equal rights to Catholics. Therefore, a valuable tool for recruitment and building a broader coalition was sadly missed. Catholic delegate Charles Carroll created the second, longer document with the guidance of his brother John, a Jesuit priest.
In the letter to our Canadian brethren, John Dickinson wrote, when the fortune of war, after a gallant and glorious resistance, had incorporated you with a body of English subjects, we rejoiced in this truly valuable addition, both on our own and on your account, expecting as courage and generosity are naturally united, our brave enemies would become our hearty friends, and that the divine being would bless you the dispensations of his overruling providence, by securing to you and your latest posterity the inestimable advantages of a free English constitution of government, which it is the privilege of all English subjects to enjoy. Little did we imagine that any succeeding ministers would so audaciously and cruelly abuse the royal authority to withhold from you the fruition of the irrevocable rights to which you were thus justly entitled. The second letter, as we said, was written in combination by Dickinson and Charles Carroll, and it gave even greater directness to the support for religious toleration. Your unmerited degradation has engaged the most unfeigned pity of your sister colonies. We were both entitled by the bounty of our indulgent Creator to freedom. We perceive the fate of the Protestant and Catholic colonies to be strongly linked together, and therefore invited you to join with us in resolving to be free. The pro-American Canadians had a great deal to offer. A large number of Canadians advocated an alliance with General Washington and his army. In a letter scholars believe was written by John Allen, who was an influential merchant and politician in Nova Scotia, the letter said, you may reasonably imagine that it is presumptuous in me to take such liberty in writing to your excellency. Still, it is going from one whose principles are actuated from the genuine feelings of liberty and an indelible anxiety for the happiness of his country. The writer went on to express solidarity with America's great struggle against the crown, and strongly hinted that rebellion could be fomented in his neck of the woods with support from General Washington. We would greatly rejoice if we could join with the other colonies. We must have other assistance before we can act publicly. The British failed to recognize the tipping points underway in their North American settlements. For 200 years, historians have debated why Nova Scotia never became the 14th colony to join the American Revolution. After all, it had close ties with the rebellious colonies. An estimated 3/4 of Nova Scotia's population of 20,000 at the time of the Revolution were New Englanders. To Americans today, the idea that there were 13 colonies and 13 only seems sacrosanct. It certainly didn't look that way in 1776. Nobody then saw the Northern Territories as something separate, certainly not a separate entity called Canada. British North America was a unified unit. In March 1776, a delegation of Nova Scotians eager to lead a rebellion in their country arrived at Washington's headquarters in Cambridge just as the British were evacuating Boston. As recounted by historian Ernest Clark in his book, The Siege of Fort Cumberland, 1776, the delegation, Jonathan Eddy, Isaac Bordeaux, and Samuel Rogers, met several times with the general in a building at Harvard College. But Washington was preoccupied with where the British fleet, still anchored in Boston Harbor, would head next. Loyalist Canadian leaders showed greater initiative in adjusting policies, which was absent among many in what would become the United States. The British commander-in-chief, Sir William Howe, lamented the lack of drive among those who had rallied to the military standard of the crown. Perhaps this is an early version of the greater deference given to avoiding trouble by some Canadians. Canadians desire to enjoy, but did not expand their particular parliamentary system of government. The noted historian Robert Bothwell's book, Your Country, My Country, refers to this as a difference between the two great states. Canada seeks to maintain a bulwark of its own ideals. The United States believes it has an ideal to share with the rest of the world. Both methodologies had gifts to offer the world, the larger world. The brother nations have retained their differences today. The United States has lower taxes, more individual opportunities at its best, and Canada has less economic equality, better racial policies, and more significant opportunities for social cohesion. The advantage of the Canadian approach is that there is less focus on race. The ideal of universal equality drives the American approach. During this time frame, it was a brand new idea that ordinary people could influence government decisions. Although the British-descended government had racial troubles, the larger difficulty was that society was too focused on class. Pro-American Canadians played a strong but largely hidden role in the larger struggle for a less hierarchical society. Colonel Moses Hazen, as I mentioned before, took charge of many key events in the revolutionary struggle as head of what was called the Congress's own Canadian Regiment, which is how the pro-American Canadians were known. Colonel Hazen presided over the victory at Valcour Island, and later on, take note of this, my friends, headed the team that court-martialed Benedict Arnold when he was still on the American side for corruption that occurred when Arnold served as military governor of Pennsylvania. Hazen was promoted to brigadier general following his military defeat of Colonel John Tyson's Royal American Reformers at the Battle of Queens Heights in late 1780. The Reformers were a group of turned Continental soldiers, we call them Chowhois today, who were promised knighthoods and feudal territory in the U.S. should the British be victorious. Like the U.S., Canada was largely settled in its eastern territories during this period. George Washington thought that a Canadian military diversion would force the British in the 13 colonies to put less pressure on his beleaguered forces. It began as an American expeditionary action in Canada. However, there was great difficulty in obtaining the necessary supplies for any American expeditionary force. The British had no large-scale military presence within the province, relying on local indigenous militia within the area. Thus, the pro-American Canadians were very disappointed. Washington could not conquer Nova Scotia and put a 14th star in the flag. The website, Royalist Provincial Militia, details the creation of pro-British forces in Canada. The following is an excerpt from the Earl of Suffolk to Governor Legge of Nova Scotia. In Lord Dartmouth's absence, who was in Staffordshire for some time, I received the King's commands to signify to you His Majesty's pleasure that you do immediately take the necessary steps for raising and forming from amongst the inhabitants of Nova Scotia and in Newfoundland a corps of 1,000 men, divided into 10 companies, with the usual establishment of both commissioned and non-commissioned officers, and His Majesty is graciously pleased to allow you to command this corps with the provincial rank of colonel. The Archbishop of Quebec was reportedly bought off by a large-scale increase in the grant given to clergy with the Prime Minister's personal fund. £25,000, about $300,000 or $600,000 today, was a small price to pay for religious peace within the province. The political officials of the empire sought to maintain Canada within British hegemony as bulwarks against Spanish and American culture and Spanish and American military prowess. American culture was primarily Germanic during this period. Therefore, Prime Minister Lord North saw it vital to keep the Canadian Catholic clergy loyal to the British side. The Duke of Wellington, the hero of Waterloo, called Catholic priests those tools and troops of the Pope, which may indicate the disdain he felt towards the Catholic Church. But that disdain proved tremendously effective in creating a separate Canadian identity. As the first Prime Minister of independent Canada, John J. Macdonald, declared upon Confederation in 1867 in John Thompson's work, Canada and the United States, the Confederation, by the grace of God and history in which we live today, took a century to forge in the light of the juggernaut of our southern neighbor. There are many reasons why Canada, particularly French-speaking Canada, took a different path politically from the United States. Having understood, albeit too late, to save the larger portion of North America, how much repulsion taxation without representation stirred up, the British took great pains not to impose a similar taxation policy on what would become Canada. Following the noble concept that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, the British offered to the Catholic elite any favor it desired to maintain an alliance.
The early settlers of New England were Puritans, mostly strict Calvinists who rejected what they saw as popish elements in the Church of England and were even more terrified of unvarnished Catholicism. John Dickinson's first letter to the Canadian colonists seemed unsympathetic, perhaps even hostile, to the idea of a Canada where Catholics played an important, if not dominant, role. The Quebec Act had given control over what would become the Midwest to an enlarged Canadian dominion and permitted the French language to be used in church and court alike. The UK was to collect and dispatch tithes to Rome. The Archbishop of Quebec issued an edict forbidding disobedience to British officials as sinful. The Prime Minister, North, had paid a substantial financial incentive to the Catholic Church. Surprise. The bishops of Quebec and Nova Scotia also received those financial incentives. Interesting, huh? The idea of unity between the North American nations remains popular in both novels such as Fletcher Nibel's Night at Camp David and serious nonfiction, most notably Diane Francis's Merger of the Century. From the way history is going, it certainly seems possible fact that Canada did not join an effort to become independent with the 13 colonies was not based on one or even several issues, but based on a wide variety of topics. The British learned from the dealings with the 13 colonies that attempting to control the lives of people through taxes, religion, representation, and day to day living would result in rebellion. Canadians were persuaded to enjoy the protection and order provided by the UK so long as they perceived that they had control of things that impinged on their day to day, daily lives. The agreement to remain one of the cubs of the British lion, so to speak, has made Canada the unique mixture of ruggedness and amenability it is on the world stage today.
Now, a military victory for Britain would have required a much greater use, both politically and in the field, of the loyalist population. Those green-coated loyalists were very fierce fighters and would follow orders to the letter, but they tended not to initiate battles either against armies or for political support. Paul Smith's work, The Good Americans, detailed a large number of loyalists in New Jersey, thanks to Attorney General Cortlandt Skinner and Royal Governor William Franklin, Benny's estranged son. In Georgia, where colonial government was actually restored during the war due to the efforts largely of David George and the African American community, and in Pennsylvania, where a large number of Native Americans, Quakers, and other loyalists rallied around Joseph Goldwyn. Now, from a military standpoint, it would have needed to be a unification of two major British armies. This could have happened if General Cornwallis had linked up with General Howe, either at the famous Battle of Trenton on Christmas Day in 1776, which would have led to an entire collapse of the colonial army, or at the Battle of Short Hills, which is very dear to me because it happened not too far from my home a year later. The American army could have easily been balkanized, if not entirely crushed. Later on, when Benedict Arnold defected to the British side, he had very strong advice to make greater use of the formerly enslaved peoples and the Native Americans. Both groups made excellent guerrilla fighters. In my opinion, a large number of non-white soldiers, either of African or Native American descent, could have certainly followed up on the British successes in the Carolinas and Georgia in 1780. You might want to read Christopher Holmes' book, Rebels and Redcoats, and learn about that. I think the experience that the British had in dealing with a multiracial empire might have led to a better long-term outcome for the Native American community as well. Tribal leaders would have been rewarded, and they would have been turned into administrators and local governors, even viceroys, just as Indian princes were in Asia during the days of the British Raj. There would have been much less, perhaps not even any forcible relocations. The British understood that it is better to keep people where they are and try to improve their conditions than to force them into leaving to someplace they don't want to be. But this has been a wonderful experience. It's a little different from things you don't know, but I've had a lot of fun with it. And I hope you've enjoyed the other podcasts we've worked on. So may this be the first of many presentations.
Yeah, this first exploration of what could have been, but didn't happen in history has proved interesting. I'm sure our listeners may have different points of view, and we do welcome comments and discussions from the public. As long as we give each other mutual respect, as we always have in the people that work on this podcast, vigorous discussion is welcomed and encouraged. Look, I hope you join us again. We have some really good stuff coming and some interesting things, which I think can be of some interest. A really nice one that we have in the works is, now just give you a little tease here. What if the Norse had gone a little further south? Oh boy, some big differences. And then, yeah, it's speculative and it's kind of fun, but speculation has a value in that it allows people to see possibilities and to also be prepared for other kinds of possibilities. So it's not just pure enjoyment, it is actually probably fairly positive in the whole scheme of history to do that. So, look, we hope to have you back again. Until then, hey, have a great day. And hey, give us a like. We would really appreciate that. Okay? Bye for now.
History has as many possibilities, friends, as there are stars in the sky. So we welcome suggestions and comments, as Dr. Weber said. This has been amazing, and I'm very happy that we're bringing it out to you. Please join us again soon, won't you? Take care, friends.